If we look at overall what the police and the ADF have been doing, particularly when it does come to door knocking people who are positive cases, in the last day or so we've seen a much smaller number of people being actually home and doing the right thing as compared to a couple of days ago. But given the statistics, do you think that the police crackdown has been as effective as hoped?
Well, look, I think it's probably effective in relation to the vast majority of people. But when you're talking about people who, for whatever reason, are not going to comply with the law, it's unlikely that the police crackdown will have any effect. And the other issue, I think, is we've been concerned about the Alliance is the amount of policing that's going on in low-income areas where there may be communication issues, and fines, which are very heavy fines, are being given to people who really can't afford to pay them.
Do you think that the ADF being called in, so a more forceful approach, is necessarily the right one then?
Well, I think over time it's not. I think people become resentful. One of the problems with putting a law and order approach first rather than an educational approach and trying to bring people with you is that over time it creates resentment. We also get injustices. You can get cases where people have a legitimate reason for being where they are. Alternatively, they've misunderstood the rules because, for example, English is their second language, or they have mental health issues. There are a range of reasons why people might offend, and it's a sort of sledgehammer approach which over time diminishes, and that's why you need good, positive education campaigns.
Is it a bit of a fine line, though? Obviously, a number of people are just simply deliberately not doing the right thing, but then you've got, as you said, in a number of circumstances where English isn't their second language, but how do you bridge that line?
Well, you've got to make real efforts in those communities. I mean, you've got to target those communities with education, more education and communication, and as a last resort, you find people. And I think some of the rhetoric of the government, it's not just the government in Victoria, governments around Australia, has been very heavy-handed. And that does, I think, breed resentment. There is a fine line, of course, but you've got to give people an opportunity to explain themselves. You've also got to make sure that people are actually understanding the rules. One of the real problems, I think, in COVID experience in Victoria and elsewhere is that there are rules issued almost every day. And as we understand it, there's not one place people can go to find out what the rules are. The rules keep changing. So it is very difficult, and that has to be taken into account.
What do you make so far of the Victorian government's approach to the crisis itself?
Well, look, I'm not going to comment on the health issues, but in terms of the attitude of executive government, it has been very forceful, and there have been a lot of proclamations issued, legal instruments, if you like. And one of the complaints is that they keep changing them. One of the complaints is that they're very difficult to find. I spoke yesterday with Fiona Patton from the Reason Party, and she was saying that that's one of the issues. But I think also it's very important that the Parliament continue to meet. We need scrutiny of executive government at this time because they have been given extraordinary powers, unprecedented powers, and there needs to be an effective watchdog, and that needs to be the Parliament.
And that's one of the hardest parts at the moment, is that we don't have a parliament. We're unable to hold our leaders to account, only in what's been media conferences. But from a law perspective, do you think that there has been any breaches of the law when it does come to enforcing these rules?
Well, I think there have been cases, certainly in Victoria and elsewhere. There was a case of a man earlier in the year who I think was homeless and found on a park bench who was fined. I've got no doubt that there will be injustices. You can't issue that many fines and refer that many people to the police without there being injustices. What you want to do is try and limit them. But I think also you saw statistics this week in Victoria showing in the first wave of COVID a disproportionate emphasis on fining people and dealing with people in low-income suburbs. One of the issues with fines is that if you set them too high, they just don't get paid. People will find ways not to pay them. They just don't have the money. And so you've got to make sure that the fines are proportionate. $5,000 in a fine is extraordinarily high. It's much higher, certainly, than, for example, drink driving fines. And it's beyond the capability of many people to pay them. And so what you don't want to see is a huge increase in the number of unpaid fines in Victoria.
And can I just ask you as well on the border situation? We know a number of states and territories have extended their lockdowns and extended the fact that nobody can come into their state or territory. I mean, what do you make of that? Obviously, not from a health perspective, but what are the challenges surrounding that?
Well, I think the challenges, I mean, my own son lives on the border of New South Wales and Queensland, so I talked to him about it, and I think it is difficult in terms of enforcement. I mean, people who live on borders, particularly New South Wales, Victoria and Queensland and Victoria, they're very porous because, of course, people do business on and do recreation and education on both sides of the border, and so it's very difficult. The other issue about borders is, of course, that there had been talk of a constitutional challenge, which has fallen away a little bit. But the longer this crisis goes, the less likely it is, I think, that those borders closures can be sustainable in the longer term. If for example, in Tasmania, where I am, the government has yet to open borders to, say, Western Australia and the Northern Territory, and yet they've got no cases or very few cases. And I think the longer it goes that you don't open your borders to places where it's safe, the less likely it is that they are constitutional.